Good morning. Welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Senator Black, retired senator, and we've got some interesting things this morning. They tend to be on the international front, but not all. Let me just start. I want to start with an interesting article that came out of the Washington Post. Now, today, let me first give you a rundown. We're gonna touch on three topics. One is going to be that the GOP is turning against the Ukraine war. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Russia and some legislation that they have that criminalizes the dissemination of homosexual literature. And then we've got a good news story at the end where there's a federal judge who has awarded a young woman from Virginia Tech who was a soccer player, a star soccer player, and she refused to kneel in submission to the revolutionary movement of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. And so the federal judge has awarded her a settlement of $100,000 to continue her education. And so that's some good news there. But let me just get right into this Washington Post story. Very interesting and I think very well done by the Washington Post. I'm not a great fan of the Washington Post, but their article is entitled "The GOP's Shift Against Supporting Ukraine Hits a New Milestone." And they start right off saying that, excuse me, that polls are showing that the GOP is continuing to turn against sending money to Ukraine. Just this week, there was a CBS YouGov poll. And now, because it's sponsored by CBS, you can understand it's a very liberal poll. And this was the first poll to sample public sentiment since Zelensky came and gave another one of these bizarre presentations before Congress in December. And so it really was sort of testing whether Zelensky's latest plea for an open wallet, an open spigot from the U.S. Treasury was influential. How many people did it turn? And what they found is that a majority of Republicans today, 52% to 48%. Hey, John.
My apologies. I'm actually coming from another podcast that I was just finishing up an interview from. So I'm with you. I'm here.
Okay, good. Well, we're just talking about the GOP shifting against the Ukraine war, and
thank goodness.
And this CBS News poll from just this week that shows that now a majority of Republicans want their congressional representative to oppose any further funding for Ukraine. Not that they want it diminished or moderated or maybe give some of this or some of that. They want it cut off. They want it ended. They want it stopped. And then the Post runs through sort of a little bit of a history of where we came from back starting February 24th of last year when Russia entered this long-running war that had been raging between Ukraine and the Russian-speaking areas along the border, and they said initially that Ukraine was a very bipartisan issue, and then gradually Republicans' opposition grew very sharply and went from single digits to 48%, and so there's been this very rapid erosion of Republican and I think independent support for the war. And they mentioned a Chicago Council poll, and that one said that it gave people a choice. It said, on the one hand, support Ukraine for as long as it takes, which is Joe Biden's approach. On the other, it said, make peace, even if it means that that Ukraine has to give up some territory. Republicans supported making peace and giving up territory by a 2/3 majority, 63% to 33, which is a whopping difference. And so it's very interesting. What do you think, John? You sense the same kind of a shift taking place with people you're interacting with?
You know, in some cases, yes. It actually surprised me. I had a little bit of a conflict a few weeks ago with a really good friend who came in. It was the week that Zelensky almost caused World War III when the Ukrainians dropped those missiles into Poland. And they were trying to get, Article 4, I think it is, of NATO to, that basically everyone joins in the war. And he had come in talking about how much he was so, moved by Zelensky. And I'm like, dude, who are you listening to? This guy has shut down all opposition parties. There's no First Amendment or, no free speech anymore in that country. And they've got a freaking Nazi battalion leading their charge against the Russians, and it surprised me how good people, smart people, conservative people have been completely deceived about what's really going on. And so the good news is I do think that there is a move in the other direction. People, particularly with this latest $1.7 billion in approvals and another almost $100 billion to Ukraine, people are sitting there scratching their heads going, how do we keep dumping money over there in our own border, which would cost $5 billion to fix, isn't getting anything? I think a lot of people are starting to scratch their head a little bit. One of the big reasons I think things have changed since then, quite honestly, is Twitter, is that there's free speech again on Twitter, and a lot of folks are finally getting truth. So
hallelujah for that.
Yeah. So thank you, Elon Musk, and all the people who rejoined Twitter and are stating the way it is. So yeah, I think there is a shift. But let me ask you this, because you fought, you saw people die beside you in Vietnam in a war that was unpopular, that a lot of folks were trying to stop, and you were out there prosecuting that war. Describe what that was like as a Marine, moving into a situation in which you knew wasn't even popularly supported, and yet you had to diligently carry out the orders of those in charge of you. Well, describe what that's like, because we're kind of at that point right now.
Yeah, it was a much different situation because, in essence, what you had in Vietnam is you had a venomous communist government. It was a Stalinist government. It was a Marxist, Bolshevik sort of a government that had killed 50,000 Christians in North Vietnam. And they began to drive to the south. And ultimately, when the Democrats ousted Richard Nixon from the presidency, the first thing Democrats did is they cut off every cent of weapons, of ammunition, and they just they just slaughtered the South Vietnamese people. But even though I didn't appreciate the way the war began. Now, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson started the war, and they started it on a false premise. But once we were in there, we were definitely fighting on the right side. It was, you had about 10% Christians in South Vietnam, and we certainly were on their side against the North, and the North was extremely brutal towards people. So I felt like we were very much on the right side. We were very united as a military force. But then we had we had communist elements begin to infiltrate Department of Defense. And I recall one time I was with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines on Operation Independence, and we had bottled up a regiment, a full regiment of Main Force Viet Cong. We were going to slaughter them because they were on essentially it was like a peninsula formed by 2 significant rivers. We had driven them down into this. There were no tunnels because you had the rivers. So you didn't have tunnels where they could escape. And we were on the verge of slaughtering them. My company had just been hit by a round of 155, or maybe it was 8-inch white phosphorus exploded in the middle of us. We were under attack by the Viet Cong. And it's the only time that I ever fired a mortar in my life. And I ran over. Everybody was hugging the ground. It created sort of terror with all the flaming white phosphorus falling on us and burning our clothes and so forth. And I ran up to this one guy, and he's hugging the ground, and he's a mortar man. He's got the mortar tube, and I yanked him up by his shirt. I said, "Hey," I said, "you know how to fire this thing?" And right away he grinned. He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Come on." I said, "We're going to get some mortars going off." So I held the tube and aimed it while he prepared the shells and threw them down. And then I yelled over to my FAC team, forward air control team, and I said, "Smitty," I said, "I want you guys to get a slow, orderly rate of fire on the far tree line." I said 2 inches or 2 fingers apart. That was the way that you gave the signal how to distribute fires. And old Smitty got all of our team fired. So ironically, with all the confusion that was caused by the artillery strike, it was the forward air control team that returned first fire and inspired Bravo Company, 1st Marine Regiment to sort of wake up and get moving, start fighting.
Well, you got to leave it to the air power to actually, achieve superiority in order to inspire you ground pounders.
Well, you don't normally do that, but where I was going is we fought this very bitter battle that one man died from his burns and so forth, and then we're on the verge of just annihilating this group. They were just bottled up. Well, they got word from Hanoi back to Department of Defense, "Hey, we're in big trouble." And they declared, they got Lyndon Johnson to declare a ceasefire. And not only did they order the ceasefire, but just to rub ashes in our eyes, they wouldn't let us withdraw from where we were. We had attacked through Viet Cong trench lines, and as we attacked forward, the Viet Cong came and they reoccupied the trench lines on the high ground. And instead of evacuating from where we were, they required us to go back up the hill through the trench line without opening fire. And we were not allowed to fire unless fired upon. And so I watched the entire 1st Battalion, 1st Marines online. They got 2 heroic volunteers, a couple young guys who just were gutsy kids, and they walked as an advance point, and we just sat there and we watched them walk up to the trench line where both of them were gunned down, and they rolled down the hill. And at that point, we were allowed to return fire and to attack against the trench line. But it was that kind of despicable, loathsome betrayal of the American troops in the field that's erased from the history books today. But we had Bolshevik, Marxist, communist in the Department of Defense, in key positions, in close contact with the communists in North Vietnam. And so, there has never been a finer U.S. military. Army or Marine Corps on the ground. They were highly disciplined, motivated. You wouldn't know it from the old Vietnam movies, all of the craziness in those. But in any event, I fought in incredibly fierce battles over there, and no regrets about what we did there. But at the same time, I do not want to see us and see our young men fighting for an absolute despotic tyrant who is Zelensky in Ukraine. The man
does have nice sweatsuits.
Well, he's, Hollywood outfitted him with T-shirts. I call him Mr. T-shirt. And, he calls on the Ukrainians to fight to their death while he sits back and sips cocktails and makes media appearances.
Well, he's at Davos this week, so apparently trying to get some more money.
The boys from Davos.
More Davos, yeah. But it's interesting because I think what you're highlighting is this is where we could be if we continue down the path that the left certainly is pushing us towards, where we end up with U.S. troops in Ukraine fighting a useless war, a war that's not going to end well. There's no good outcome, and hundreds of thousands, just almost 100,000 died in the Vietnam War, and we're right back into it again, just like we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's awful because you're right. There's so many good people that are harmed from all that, die or permanently emotionally destroyed. And that's where we're going to. There is no good ending point for this war other than let them figure it out over there and then get back to focusing on the problems we have in this country. We have no shortage of problems in this country, but it doesn't appear that those in power, or at least that are being controlled by our friends in Davos, are willing to even think about that because they're so deeply controlled by this global elite that wants to have ongoing endless wars.
The boys from Davos, and I use that term more broadly than just Davos, but they're part of it. These are the globalists. They really don't have a loyalty to nations. So somebody from America who's one of the Davos people, they're not likely to have a great patriotic love for this country. They're not the kind of people who actually sacrifice like you and I have sacrificed in battle. They view themselves more as citizens of the world. They're part of the cultural elite. So you get the kings and the princes, and you've got the media moguls and the bankers and the dynasty families. And they all go to Davos. Years ago, it used to cost $200,000 for a ticket. Today, it may be $500,000. I don't know. And then, just your spending money is going to be another $500,000, maybe a couple of million. You got to buy cocktails and you got to get your evening entertainment.
And don't forget the sweatsuit. You got to have the authorized sweatsuit.
Yes, and you've got to have your private jet with your crew and all to carry your bags and shine your shoes and this kind of thing. So somebody who goes there, they may spend $5 million on the trip, and the interesting thing is about 2,000 people who come together, and when you have 2,000 people, you can't just get together for a week and 2,000 people sort things out. So you've got a very small group headed by Klaus Schwab, and they prepare the agenda for what the future will be. What will the world do? And this is the global dictatorship that it's functional, it's real, it's here today and now, and you never know. I mean, if they decided, it's time to wrap up this thing in Ukraine, it'd be over in 2 weeks. If they decided that at Davos, the war would be over in 2 weeks. they're not going to decide because there is now this vast sea of U.S. dollars because the latest bill, they appropriated 45 billion more. So in total, it's 110 billion.
Yeah, they got a lot of laundering to do of sweatsuits in Ukraine to turn those into dollars in the hands of oligarchs and other NGOs and friends of.
And the sons of senators. You know, you look at Hunter Biden and how he, you know, he couldn't even speak the language. He knew nothing about the business, and yet he's getting big bucks from the Burisma over there, and then his daddy sweeps in, and had the
his chief prosecutor is fired.
The courage to publicly state that he fired the prosecutor who was investigating his son for corruption. Well, that's dicey. And so, I mean, the crooked stuff that's going on in Ukraine, it's just unbelievable. And Americans got whipped into sort of a blind, unthinking war hysteria. When all the media bombards you, you know, it's very much like the 3-minute hate in 1984, where, you know, before long people are screaming at the screen, and they've done it they did it with COVID, they did it with Ukraine, they did it with the demonstrations at the Capitol. Different things. When they want to generate hate and hysteria, they do it. And anyway, you know, it's interesting when Speaker Paul Ryan was the Republican Speaker of the House, he wouldn't appropriate $1 for Trump to build his wall. Trump had to do all kinds of innovative financing to squeeze out a few million here and there. And meanwhile, when the deep state gives their orders, when the boys from Davos, the globalists, all of a sudden we cough up $1/10 trillion that we don't even have. It's just printed money out of thin air.
You know, to take that one step further, I heard yesterday economically that the value of $1 became 95 cents as a result of that $1.7 trillion bill. Everybody just lost 5% on the dollar. That's how bad it is of what's going on. And when we start talking trillions of dollars, people can't even translate that. But I think it's an important measure for people to appreciate that everybody just lost 5% on everything they own based on that bill. And 1/10 of that, or not 1/10, I guess 5% of that went to Ukraine. And and a whole bunch of others went to wokeism and, you know, climate change and everything except the real problems in our country, which I think is what Ukraine really is. I think people are waking up to is that we got no dog in that fight over there. And yet we've got all of these problems here at home, and they're not being addressed except by, you know, 20 congressmen who are willing to take some darts and stand up and say, hey, we need to actually have debate again in the House of Representatives. So I think lights are slowly being turned back on. It amazes me how hard it is. And hopefully our listeners are seeing by now that we want to get the truth out because so few media sources are actually addressing what's true. And Ukraine, for those of you listening out there, is a mess, and we shouldn't be there. It's clear we shouldn't be there. We got to find a way to get back out. It doesn't mean the Ukrainian people don't deserve peace, don't deserve to be left alone by the Russians, but we can't solve every problem worldwide. And right now, trying to solve that problem, only thing it's doing is strengthening these people in Davos and the Hunter Bidens of the world and others, all the corrupt people, and making them stronger. Such few amounts of dollars are actually getting to the intended purpose. And when they do get to the intended purpose, it's just prolonging something that's inevitable, which is that the Russians are really bothered by NATO's expansion. That needs to stop. Russia's not a threat unless they get backed in a corner and launch World War III. That's what we're dealing with,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is all the more reason why we need to wrap this up and get back to figuring out how do we control our own border? How do we get our own economic situation under control? How do we get to where we can assure people we're going to stop spending money that we don't have? And we start to allow the U.S. population to have confidence again in its elections, in its school systems, and can once again know that this country is going to be restored to the land of liberty, the land where freedom and the whole concept of a constitutional republic was born. That's what we got to get back to.
Well, John, I don't know whether you saw our next topic. Russia has outlawed homosexual propaganda, and they've just opened their first LGBT propaganda case. I don't know whether you had picked up on that or not.
I try to keep up on all the Russian homosexual literature, but I missed this one. So I'm glad you're letting me know about it.
Well, it's interesting. It's important for people to understand that the Russian Federation of today, it's almost the mirror image of the Soviet Union. It's almost the opposite in many respects. The old Soviet Union was immoral. It was decadent. It was anti-Christian. It was an atheist, officially atheist nation, and now Russia is the most Christian major nation in Europe. And one of the things that they've done is their constitution says that marriage is the union of one man and one woman. And they've passed legislation. And about a month ago, President Putin signed into law a bill that emerged from the Duma. I don't think he necessarily had much to do with it other than to approve it. But they have approved hefty fines, criminal fines, for people found guilty of promoting non-traditional sexual relations, such as pedophilia, transgenderism, and it applies both to minors and to adults. So it's much more pro-family than anything that you can find in the United States and perhaps anywhere in the Western world. But there's a company called Popcorn Books, and they operate in Russia, and they kind of defied the law. It wasn't that they were ignorant of it. They actually began to decorate their covers with quotes from the Constitution of Russia that prohibit censorship and that guarantee freedom of speech. And they are very famous for pushing a novel called Summer of a Pioneer Tie. I don't know what tie means, but this is under the old Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union was very anti-family, whereas the new Russia is very pro-family. They actually have a provision on parental rights in their constitution. But under the Soviet Union, they love to break children from their parents, put them in communes, free sex for the counselors who took care of them, free sex with minors. And so this book by Popcorn Books entitled Summer in a Pioneer Tie.
That guy doesn't have anything to do with that guy that Joe Biden keeps talking about, is it?
I'm sure there are plenty of guys in Biden.
Corn pop, not popcorn. Excuse me.
Oh,
sorry.
Corn pop.
That might be a relationship. Just as you talk about this, Senator, it's actually kind of inspiring if you think about how bad Russia had gotten, to see that they've returned to the bedrock of their moral history. And and they've really actually become a moral nation again. They're not portrayed that way, obviously, in the press here. And I'm not saying Putin is probably the most moral person on the planet, but as a nation, they've returned to their roots. And
Yeah.
it gives me hope that this nation, which has gone way off the rails, has an opportunity to do the same. It takes time. Obviously, it's been almost 30 years since the last of Gorbachev and those folks, and they've gone through their perestroika, I think they call it. I can't pronounce that right.
Perestroika.
Perestroika, yeah. But look what they've done. They have returned to a foundation that actually is healthy for society, and thank goodness that's actually taking place. And I saw one other thing that we can be encouraged by is back on the home front, is that people who are exercising their freedom are being rewarded. Certainly I got my acquittal last week or week before last.
Hey.
But a federal judge awarded $100,000 to a soccer player here in Virginia who refused to kneel for the national anthem. So there's good news breaking out. There's good news breaking out in Russia. There's good news breaking out in our own country. And we can end on a positive note that freedom can return if enough people, enough individuals are willing to stand and to speak the truth and to return to the bedrocks that this nation was founded on.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say a word for Kirsten Henning. She's a very, very beautiful young soccer player, great athlete. And according to her complaint, she was benched after she defied the whole team, and she refused to knuckle under to this racist movement that swept the country, this revolutionary Black Lives Matter, Antifa inspired hate movement, where they would, you'd have these athletes and they would kneel rather than stand for the national anthem. And they would do it really as a show of hatred for America and contempt for their fans who came to see them, who paid money. And after a while, they did it, and gradually the stands just emptied out, and you'd see these big football stadiums, and there'd be maybe 10% of the seats filled. I mean, they were empty. And so you had somebody. Here's Kirsten Henning. She, as one courageous young lady, she just says, "I'm not going to kneel."
Thank goodness for people like that, because that's what turns the tide. That's what turns the tide. But looks like we're kind of out of time for today, sir. But it's great to end on a positive note, and to note that right here in Virginia, the birthplace of freedom is returning to the birthplace of freedom.
We're coming back. We sure are. Well, listen, thank you all for listening. We will be back with you at 11 o'clock on Wednesday. This has been Focus on the News. Thank you for joining us.